pelt by pelt. We could come with cannons. Of course, what they meant by cannon was like a bazooka, a grenade launcher. It shot a shell as big as my fist. It couldn't do that much damage, you see, but it could make a lot of noise and intimidate a lot of people. And they said, we're going to come there and just say, we want 100 pelts from this village by tonight. Get out there and hunt. And if you don't deliver the pelts, we'll aim our artillery at your smokehouses. Now you see, if you've spent June, July, and August catching salmon and smoking it in order to have food for the whole winter, what they're really threatening you with is starvation. Okay, we'll hunt. And this was a kind of extortion that was going on. And the monks were told, oh, we built a church, we built a school, we built a rectory, everything you need for liturgical services, candles, incense, it's all there. None of this was true. So St. Herman and the other monks arrived on Kodiak Island and discovered that they'd been had. And that the natives were not being treated well, but were being enslaved and exploited and abused. And they began writing letters back to the authorities in Russia about it. But the letters had to go out on company ships because those were the only vessels coming. And so it's interesting, you see the monks writing, and Baranov, Alexander Baranov, from the island to our left is named. The island on which Sitka stands is Baranov Island. They mispronounce it Baranov, but it's the same guy. And there's a statue to Mr. Baranov in the middle of Sitka because he's the founder of the town. But he was not, from a native point of view, and even from the point of view of St. Herman and the other monks, he was not a nice guy. He was the one who was making megabucks, or rubles, for the company, but at the expense of the native people, to whom the mission had been sent to convert. So you see what an impossible situation that was. The monks gave up, several of them went back to report directly to the governor in Irkutsk. Father Yosef, the only one with a seminary education, Archimandrite Yosef, was consecrated Bishop of Kodiak with authority to arrest Baranov and send him back, if necessary, in chains. But the ship bringing them back from Russia sank in a storm. And the Baranov regime lasted another 17 years. Eventually, Father Herman was the only one left. And that's why he moved to Spruce Island, continued to write his letters of protest, but he had to get out of town because they were trying to assassinate him in Kodiak. He didn't move to Spruce Island because he was looking for a quiet place to pray. He moved to Spruce Island because if he had stayed in Kodiak, he would have been killed. That's the background story, you see. And so by 1837, when Father Herman died in the forest on Spruce Island, the mission had pretty much disappeared. It had collapsed. They started with great enthusiasm. They had baptized thousands of converts. And the interesting point here is, as I was told by Kodiak Alutiiq people, they ran from when they saw the Russian-American company boat come because they knew what was going to happen. But when they saw the monks come, they rushed down to the beach and embraced and welcomed them. And the reason they did that was their own shamans told them to go and meet these men and do as these men taught. And so it was like the Old Testament prophets preparing the way for Christ. The shamans of the Alutiiq people prepared the way for Christianity. And so the mission was, in a certain sense, a great success, but by the end there were no priests. They had drowned, they had died. Father Juvenali had been martyred, as we described already, and it had all kind of petered out. The authorities back in Russia were rather concerned about this, and they tried to recruit priests to go to Alaska. But remember, in these days, Alaska had not even been mapped. You might get an enthusiastic seminary graduate to volunteer, but you would probably never get his wife to agree. And that's where our story begins. In 1824, the appeal had been out for many years for at least somebody to go to Kodiak, someone to go to the Aleutian Islands, someone to be, because these people were already baptized. The people in the Aleutian Islands had accepted Orthodox Christianity. They had chapels in every village since before the monks came, but there was no priest there. And how long is this faith going to survive? Yeah. The Aleutian Islands stretch from Attu here all the way to the Alaska mainland. It's 1,000 miles. Here's Alaska, we're down here, sailing toward Juneau. But from here, if you put this map on the continental United States, Ketchikan could touch Savannah, Georgia, and Attu would touch San Diego, California.
Wow.
Usually when you have a map of Alaska, they shrink it down to the size of Connecticut and put it in the corner.
Yes.
But the actual size, Alaska would have 4 time zones. It's as wide as the entire lower 48 states. And we have 5 main cultural groups: the Tlingit Indians who inhabit this region, the Athabascan Indians who inhabit the interior of Alaska. They are related to the Navajo and Apache in Arizona. When I meet Navajo and Apache people, I always tease them that they are Alaskans who couldn't hack it. The North Slope is Inuit. The people in Canada, they're all Inuit, so they insist on calling their Eskimo people Inuit. But we don't just have Inuit. We have Inuit here, Siberian Yupik here, Central Yupik here, Alutiiq here, and Unangan here. We have 5 Eskimo groups. They don't want to be called Inuit because they're not, you see. So they're happy being called Eskimo. So in case you were wondering about, you hear the rumor, they don't want to be called Eskimo anymore. Well, yes and no. In Canada, that's true. It's not true here. The Canadians had igloos. We never did. But you see it in every Alaskan coloring book, as if we lived in ice houses. It never happened. There are all kinds of these kind of myths and distortions of our story. But we're talking about the Aleutian Islands, no priests. So 1897, a young boy was born near Lake Baikal, in the village of Anginsk, near Irkutsk, in Siberia. You only know these places if you play the board game Risk. Yes. And then you know Yakutsk, Kamchatka. In any case, his name was Yuan Popov. Yuan John, and Popov like the most common Russian possible name, like John Smith in English. But he was an orphan, you could say. His father had died. He was raised by his uncle. His uncle was the town fixer-up, or the town tinker man, the man who went around and fixed everybody's broken whatever it was. And because of this, Yuan Popov, at an early age, 7, 8, 9 years old, was always interested in taking things apart and putting them back together. He was a kind of mechanical genius, in fact. By the time he was 10 years old, he was making watches and giving them to his friends as gifts. He was in the clerical caste, according to Peter the Great's rules, and so he entered seminary. Seminary, we should remember, in Russia in the 1800s was basically like a high school. It wasn't a graduate school of theology like St. Vladimir's Holy Cross. You didn't go to college first and then seminary. Seminary was the equivalent to 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades. So he was the valedictorian, however, of his class, the best of the brightest. And because there are probably, I'm guessing, several other Yuan Popovs in the group, the faculty decided to give him a new last name. Now for us that might be a little awkward. We're attached to our last name. How else can you do a genealogy if your last name keeps changing? People who have had this problem with immigration at Ellis Island have a hard time tracing their ancestry for the same reason. But Russians had not had surnames. Peter the Great had decreed that Russians would have last names, but in most villages it was hardly necessary. The population is small enough that everybody knows all the Iwans and all the Veras and all the Theophans in the town, and if there were 2 or 3 of them, their father's name was different. So you had Timofey Nikolaevich and Timofey Mikhailovich. You could tell the two apart from their patronymics. Last names were unnecessary. But the Tsar said we all have to have last names because the Dutch and the Germans and the English all have last names, and we have to do things in the modern European way. So people had only recently been assigned their last names. They weren't particularly attached to them, in other words. So when they decided that this Yuan Popov had to be distinguished as the valedictorian of his class, they gave him a new name, Benjamin, in honor of the recently deceased and highly respected bishop of Irkutsk, Bishop Benjamin. So he became Yuan, at graduation from seminary, he became Yuan Benyaminov. Yuan Benyaminov then went to the bishop and said, I volunteer for Alaska. And the bishop said, not you. You're the best and the brightest. We want to send you to St. Petersburg to the Theological Academy. We want to add you to our faculty. You need an academic career. You need something, not Alaska, not you. And he insisted. And finally, the bishop relented. And then he had to go home and tell his wife, Catherine. And we know, he writes in his own memoirs, he didn't have the heart to just come right and say, by the way, dear, we're moving to Alaska, which would be like going to the moon, right? He picked up his 2-year-old daughter, Anna, and said, oh, I wonder where these little feet will be running next year. That was why, John, you didn't. He did, and the year later, they came to Sitka. He came to Sitka because that's where the boat took him. His assignment was the Aleutian Islands, but he came all the way here to Sitka. Sitka at that time, we're talking 1824, 25, 26, at that time was an Aleut community. Even though it's in the heart of the Tlingit region, the people who lived in Sitka were not Tlingit, because Baranov, our nemesis, I call him the Joseph Stalin of Alaska history. Baranov had not only conquered the Kodiak Alutiiq people, but he had established a trading post exactly where our ship is going to land in Sitka, north of the town. It's called Old Sitka. It's a trading post. He brought several hundred Alutiiq and Unangan Aleut men to operate the trading post and also to hunt sea otters in southeast Alaska. As far as we know, he had negotiated with the Tlingits an agreement where he paid a certain amount of rent, and they agreed to let him run his trading post. But 2 years later, they burnt it down and killed all the residents of the trading post. Now, it turns out that it wasn't the Tlingit idea to do that. The British, as you can see, are right next door, and the Hudson Bay Company wanted to move into this area. But in order to do that, they had to push the Russians out. So the British armed the Tlingits, gave them the guns, and set them and paid them like mercenaries to attack the Russian outpost and burn it down. Most of the men were out hunting, so the casualties were relatively few. 70 or 80 men were killed, and the trading post was completely demolished, burnt to the ground. The survivors were picked up suspiciously by another British ship and brought to Kodiak, where the British captain demanded thousands of dollars in ransom to release the men he had rescued. And Baranov was doubly furious, because he knew it was the British who were behind the whole thing. But in the meantime, his outpost in southeast Alaska had been eliminated. He started building ships in what is today Seward. The Russians called it Resurrection Bay, because Baranov discovered it on Pascha. But in any case, they started building ships because they were going to get back to southeast Alaska and reassert their claim. And they felt justified in that because these men had died and the Tlingits had betrayed them, even though they had had this rental agreement with them. Who rents land and then burns down the apartment building? This didn't make sense, but the British were behind it. In any case, when we land in Sitka in a couple of days, we will land at the very place where that trading post was. You could walk from where the cruise ship is going to dock to the site of that trading post just slightly to the north. But then Baranov commandeered a Russian naval vessel, the Neva, and he didn't have to wait for his ships to be built. The British had told the Tlingits, however, be careful, they're going to come back, and they gave the Tlingits the information on the range of the Russian cannon. So the Tlingit built their fort just out of cannon range. So the Russians, 1,000 Aleut kayaks, each with two warriors in it, so 2,000 Aleut men, joined this flotilla, this D-Day invasion of southeast Alaska. The Aleuts were ready to get even too, because it was their men who had been killed in the first Battle of Sitka in 1802. This was 1804. Baranov landed with the Aleuts on the beach. The Tlingits poured out of the fort and ambushed them from behind. They fought to a draw. Baranov himself was wounded. So Baranov went out to his ship and ran up a white flag, not to surrender, but to call truce. Let's negotiate. Now this is one of the most bizarre episodes in our history. There were widows, Tlingit women, who had married Aleut men at the fort. Their own husbands had been killed by their own people when the fort was attacked, and they were left as widows. But they had no place to go but back to the Tlingit community. So the Tlingit elders considered these women who had lived with the Aleuts as informants. They went to these women what does that white flag mean? The women had no idea. Their best guess, however, was they will show no mercy. They will wipe us out clean as snow. Which in fact is the exact opposite of what the truce flag meant. And because of this, the Tlingits withdrew silently at night from the fort, so that when the battle resumed on the next day, the Aleuts and Baranov and the few Russians who were with him found the fort empty. And if we have time, the fort site is still there in Sitka. There's a memorial to those who fought in this battle in 1804. And it's at this extreme, what would it be, east end of Lincoln Street. On Lincoln Street are the two buildings I'm going to talk about now. At the far end of Lincoln Street is Castle Hill, where on October 18th, 1867, exactly 150 years ago next month, Alaska was transferred from Russian rule to American rule. It's all on one street in Sitka. But we unfortunately don't have enough time to go to every place in Sitka. But that's the story. We're visiting Sitka where all this happened. Now, Benjaminov is in Sitka. The town, there are no Tlingits. Even though we're in the center of the Tlingit world, the Tlingits have moved away because of the battle. The people who built Sitka were the Aleuts that Baranov brought down there. They're the ones who built all the houses, built all the ships, ran all the stores, ran the hospital. It was Alaska Native people who were being trained to do that, not Russians. For the simple reason that the Russian government forbade Russians to settle in Alaska. This was not Plymouth Rock or Jamestown kind of colony. You were not allowed, you could work for the company if you had a contract, but when your contract expired, legally you had to go back to Russia. The Russian imperial government was opposed to settling Russians in the New World for the simple fact that Siberia is wide empty and the Chinese are just next door, right? And they weren't interested in exporting their population to the New World. So by definition, who was going to run the colony in Alaska? It had to be the Alaska Native people. And so when Johann Benjaminov arrived in Sitka in 1826, he was in an Aleut community. And he was assigned to the Aleutian Islands, so he began learning the Unangan Aleut language in Sitka. He devised an alphabet for Unangan Aleut in Sitka. By the time he arrived at his headquarters in Oleska, Dutch Harbor, made famous now by Deadliest Catch, if you know that TV show. They built him a special kayak because Aleuts at that time were probably about 5'2", 5'3". He was 6'4".
Oh, wow.
They had to measure his body parts and build him a special kayak. And then he kayaked out the 1,000 miles of the Aleutian chain, preaching in the Unangan Aleut language to all these people. He encountered at Akun Island, which is here, a shaman. All the people were waiting on the beach for him. Now these islands look small, but each of them have hundreds of miles of coastline. The island itself may only be 8 miles long, and it will still have 250 miles of coastline because of the bays and the inlets in that time. So when he arrived at Akun Island, the entire population of the village was waiting for him, several hundred people, in their best clothing. Like their Sunday go-to-meet in Kamalekas. And how did you know I was coming? How did you know to meet me at this particular bay? Our shaman told us. He goes to the village. He meets people who have been healed by the shaman. Finally, they tell him, when we're hungry, we ask the shaman where to find food, and he tells us where to go. And we always find food because our shaman knows. How does he know these things? Ask him. So, Father Yuan asked to meet the shaman. The shaman appeared. How do you know what you know? Oh, my helping spirits tell me. Your helping spirits. What do they look like? And he describes them as angels in what would appear for us in subdeacon's vestments, with orars and pink robes. And what do they tell you? They tell us to do what you tell us. The same teachings as you. Do they demand that you worship them? Never. They forbid it. More and more he's suspicious. Will they appear to me? I'll check. He comes back the next day and he says, my spirits are willing to appear to you and to talk with you, but they want to know why you want to meet them. Do you suspect that they are evil? Do you suspect that they are demons? That they are somehow evil spirits? And at this point, Father Yuan gets rather frightened. No, he doesn't suspect that at all. He suspects that they're angels. But then he says, but who am I to meet with angels? It might go to my head. I might think I'm something special. So he writes all of this down as a report to his bishop back in Irkutsk. And asks for direction, for advice. Well, you know, postage then was even slower than now. It took a year for his letter to get to Irkutsk. It took another year for the bishop's response. And by the way, the bishop said, go ahead, I'm interested, tell me more. But by the time he came back to Akun Island, the shaman had died. And so but what this says is, you see, like the missionaries from Valam, he was open to the possibility that God had worked among these people before the Christians showed up. Too often Christian missionaries act like they have the monopoly on God. And only they really know. And anything that other people know has to be dismissed as demonic even. But that's a sin against the Holy Spirit, because the Holy Spirit can go wherever he wants. And Veniaminov's experience was, these people knew a lot about God before he came. And they were being guided by the shaman, and the shamans on Kodiak Island. It was the same thing. They were inspired to tell their people to go meet the missionaries and to be baptized. And that's what accounts for their baptism. Otherwise they would have fled to the hills when the Russians showed up. Instead they welcomed them. But this was the shamans doing. So the shamans in Alaska consistently played the role of Old Testament prophets, like John the Baptist, preparing the way for the Lord to come. In any case, 10 years in the Aleutian Islands. Iwan Veniaminov paddling 1,000 miles out and 1,000 miles back and visiting his people, marrying, baptizing, chrismating, burying, having memorial services, celebrating, teaching the people, and translated the Gospel of Matthew in his first 3 months. Translated the Gospel of Matthew into Unangan Aleut using the alphabet that he had to devise for the language. Now remember, he had a high school diploma. I don't think he had classical linguistics training, but he had a very good ear. And he devised one letter for every sound in the Unangan alphabet. So once you knew the alphabet, you could read. Then he had to open schools, because what good is it to have translations and books when he's the only one who can read them? So the first Unangan schools and the first churches and the translation, he wrote the first book in the Unangan language called Indication of the Way to the Kingdom of Heaven. It's translated into German, French, Russian, English. It's still available. It's basically a kind of Bible story catechism to instruct his people in what does it mean to be a Christian, but in their own language. 10 years in the Aleutian Islands. And then he was transferred back to Sitka, because by this time the Tlingits who had moved away to the north end of Baranov Island were moving back, feeling that it was more or less safe to return to their original village site at New Archangel. New Archangel, the name that the Russians gave to Sitka. For the simple reason that in 1813, that same ship, the Neva, that had been involved in the original battle, returned with a cargo of company employees and church supplies. And the Neva was wrecked. For a while we thought that there were no survivors, but recently we've discovered that the survivors who swam ashore at a nearby island lived there for several months and survived and were eventually rescued by the Tlingits. But for years we thought there were no survivors when the Neva sank. The one thing that we know did survive was an icon. A month after the sinking of the Neva, back in 1813, this icon washed ashore. And it was found in the rocks in what is basically now downtown Sitka. And it's an icon of St. Michael the Archangel, which is why the cathedral was named St. Michael the Archangel, and the whole town was given the name New Archangel. So now Iwan Veniaminov is back in Sitka, and he has to start all over again with the Tlingits. The language is totally different and grammatically much more difficult. He struggled. I think the Tlingit language has, from our way of hearing, 8 different kinds of K. Well, you can use a K, and you can use an X, and after that, in our alphabet, we're kind of out of letters that represent that sound. And he struggled, we know from his writings, he struggled to come, he could hear these sounds, he just couldn't figure out how to write them down in a consistent way. But he began translating Holy Scripture and church services and the evangelization of the Tlingit people. after about 15 years now, 10 in the Aleutian Islands and 5 in southeast Alaska, he sent his translation to St. Petersburg to be published. And another couple of years went by and the books finally arrived. You can imagine how happy he would be to have books now for his classes, for his students, Holy Scripture, church services, prayer books, and practical books in math and science. In the native languages, he can really undertake now the educational work, and there were so many typographical errors that the books were gobbledygook. They were nonsense, completely useless. Crates of books that mean nothing to anyone. Well, he could have thrown in the towel, I give up. But he didn't. Instead, he wrote to the company. Baranov at least was gone by now, and the company was treating the church much more in a friendly way. He petitioned the company to go to St. Petersburg to supervise the publication of his books himself. He was the only one who could do it. And they agreed. And the kids, by this time there were 8 Veniaminov children. He did get home once in a while. The children had never seen Russia. And certainly they, on the mother's side, Catherine's side, they had grandparents who had never seen their grandchildren. So after 15 years, my goodness, the children, the wife and the kids took the ship from Sitka to Oleska, and then from here to Kamchatka, and finally Irkutsk, and they made successful voyage across the Bering Sea back to Ivan Veniaminov. His ship took him to Honolulu, Sydney, Australia, Cape Town, South Africa, the Azores, Southampton, England, Copenhagen, Denmark, and finally St. Petersburg. It was like 9 months.
He did all that in 9 months.
And by the time he got to St. Petersburg, word had reached the capital that his wife had died in a typhoid epidemic in Siberia. Of course, his immediate impulse was forget the translations. What about and one of the children had died too. My 7 kids, the 7 surviving children. But he was famous in Russia. His writings, collected as in the volume called Notes on the Unalaska District, included the flora, the fauna, the weather conditions. He had the first weather station calculating rainfall, temperature, and the rest, wind speed. For all those years in the Aleutian Islands, it's the first scientific climatic information that we have that goes back 200 years, thanks to Ivan Veniaminov, the high school graduate from Siberia. And then a description of Tlingit language and culture and what he knew about the Tlingits. All this had been bound together in a book called Notes on the Unalaska District. It was translated. It was written in Russian, and it was translated to French and German as well. And the Tsar had read this book, because this is part of the Tsar's empire he will never see himself. When it's impossible for the Tsar in St. Petersburg to make a visit to the other end of his empire in Alaska. So the Tsar summoned him to the Winter Palace and expressed his condolences. Very sorry to hear, Father Yuan, about your wife's untimely death. Yes, Father Yuan says, I'm ready to quit the whole translation project and head for Irkutsk. No, Tsar Nicholas I said, we need men like you in Alaska. I want you to go back to Alaska as bishop. He was very reluctant. Metropolitan Philaret of Moscow, who became a close friend, did his best to persuade him. Father, this is God's will. The loss of your wife and the fact that you're in St. Petersburg now, this is all coalescing to say it's God's will for you to go back to Alaska as the first bishop of this diocese. It still took them a month to convince him. He went to Kiev and prayed at the monastery of the caves and returned and said, okay, God's will be done. And they changed his name from Ioan to Innocenti, Innocent. And so Ioan Popov got a new first name as monk. Ioan, or Innocenti Veniaminov. And as Bishop Innocent, he was consecrated at the Kazan Mother of God Cathedral in St. Petersburg. They loaded him down with all kinds of gifts for the new cathedral that he would now build. And he crossed Siberia the way the monks had years before. This is now 1843. So 1842, 1843, he spent all that time. He prayed at his wife's grave. He saw his children. The Tsar promised to scholarship the kids to the schools, the best schools for which they qualified. And he went on to Sitka where the house for the bishop's residence was under construction. It was being built by both Unangan carpenters or craftsmen and Finns who had been brought all the way from Finland to do this carpentry work to build the bishop's residence, which was also called the All-Colonial School. This is where Native Alaskans were going to be trained to run the colony, not only as clergy and teachers, but as healthcare providers, navigators, cartographers. The country hadn't been mapped. All the things that the country needed, and you had to train Alaska Native people to do it. And so the school was a 6-year program, a 6-year curriculum, in which taught in the native languages. And it's the whole first floor of what we call the Russian bishop's house. His apartment was upstairs. There's another nice office or desk and his bed. You'll notice when we visit there, his bed for a man who was 6'4", the bed is only 3 feet long. I said, it can't be. He was much too big to fit in such a bed. And the tour guide said, but they slept sitting up in those days.
Oh.
They believed that lying down created respiratory problems and you would die if you lay down to sleep. So people slept in a sitting position. We learned all kinds of things from Alaska history. And there he worked on his translations. He built the desk himself. The desk is still there. His bed is still there. The clock that he built is still there on the mantle. You will see all these things when we go to Sitka. And then it was time to build the cathedral, for which he built the clock in the clock tower himself. And he became the architect for St. Michael's Cathedral, which we will visit also in Sitka. So this one man ran the school, built the house, the first seminary, the first Orthodox seminary in the New World, the Russian bishop's house. It was much more than the bishop's residence. It was all of these things. And then he designed St. Michael's Cathedral. He was doing such a good job, they promoted him. They gave him Kamchatka as additional to his diocese. Which means if you look at the map of North America, Kamchatka here, all of Alaska here, he had the whole North Pacific Ocean as his diocese. At least he had a ship instead of just a kayak. But it would take 2 years to make one survey visit of his territory. He was doing such a good job. They promoted him to be Archbishop of Yakutsk. The coldest, darkest, most inhospitable part of Siberia, where he began all over again to learn the Yakut language. Devised an alphabet for the Sakha, or Yakut people, opened the first schools, and became now an expert dog musher. He'd been on the ocean all these years, but now he was back in Siberia where he was born, and someone told me as a tourist to St. Michael's Cathedral last summer, he's now the patron saint of dog mushers. Because the last decade of his pastoral life, he was traveling around the Yakut villages. In 1868, a year after Alaska became American territory, he wrote a letter to headquarters back in St. Petersburg. He says, rumor has reached me out here in Yakutsk. And when I read that the first time, I thought, how did rumors reach anybody? I'm thinking this is a poetic license here. He's just trying to introduce the theme. Rumor has reached me that I'm against the sale of our American colonies to the United States. Nothing could be further from the truth. I see this as a great opportunity for Orthodoxy to enter North America. And if I were to be asked, no one had asked him, but he was offering his advice. If I were to be asked, I would recommend these things. First of all, do not close the mission. Do not close down the mission in Alaska. But move the headquarters to San Francisco. The climate is better. And actually, that's a direct quote actually, but he had been to Bodega Bay, Sonoma County, because the southernmost outpost of the Russian American Company, you may know, was at Fort Ross in Sonoma County. And he had gone there to close down the chapel and bring the chalice and the other ecclesial items back to Sitka. We will receive communion, I can guarantee this, I think. We will receive communion from the chalice that St. Innocent brought from California back to Sitka on Wednesday. The Fort Ross chalice. This is the Fort Ross Gospel. His hand cross is in the cathedral. Mother of pearl made in Jerusalem, given to him by the patriarch or the metropolitan in St. Petersburg at his consecration. All these things. His mitre was still in the cathedral of Sitka. These are things that are still there since this time. I lost my train of thought. He was doing such a good job. They accepted his recommendation. They did not close the mission, and they did move headquarters to San Francisco. They built a cathedral, I think it was Holy Trinity, on Powell Street. It lasted until the earthquake and fire 50 years later. And then they rebuilt the cathedral now on Green Street, Holy Trinity. But it was his idea. Not more than that. He says, and send a bishop who speaks English to that cathedral. And authorize him to ordain to the Orthodox priesthood any Americans who are qualified who will accept the teachings of our faith. Conduct the services at the cathedral in San Francisco in the English language. But this is 1868. You see what a visionary he was. Don't close the mission. Start a new one. Do it in English. Translate the services of our church as quickly as possible and publish them in the English language. 1868, Yuan Veniaminov Popov, St. Innocent, sitting in Yakutsk, Siberia, has this vision for the church in America. He was doing such a good job. At the age of 71, he was elected Metropolitan of Moscow. He was losing his eyesight. His health was not that good. He was 71 years old. And he summoned to the Moscow Kremlin to be installed, to be enthroned as the Metropolitan of the ancient capital of the Russian Empire. And I remember 30 years ago, I translated for the first time his acceptance speech. Now imagine, he's in Uspensky Sobor, the Dormition Cathedral, the historic Westminster Abbey of Russia, where the czars get crowned. That's where he's standing, and the royal family sitting there. And the faculty of the Theological Academy, of which he is now the president, is assembled. And he comes in and says, I don't know what I'm doing here. Who am I to be standing here? I'm from the boonies to start with.